September 18, 1939, was a day marked by desperation and strategic realignment as the Polish government fled the country, signaling the end of Poland's sovereignty in the face of the German and Soviet invasions. With Warsaw still under siege by the Germans and the Red Army advancing from the east, Poland found itself caught in a pincer movement from two of the world's most formidable military powers. The events of this day reflected the broader collapse of Poland's ability to resist and underscored the complex international reactions to the evolving crisis. Globally, these developments further complicated the strategic calculations of the Allied powers and deepened the resolve of neutral countries to reassess their positions in a rapidly changing world. The Polish government's flight, a nation in exile. As German and Soviet forces converged on Poland from opposite directions, the Polish government, led by President Ignacy Mościcki and Marshal Edward Rydz Śmigły, made the difficult decision to flee the country. On the night of September 17th to 18th, the Polish government crossed into Romania, seeking refuge as it became clear that further resistance on Polish soil would be futile. This exodus marked a significant moment in the history of the conflict, as it represented the effective end of Poland as a functioning state. The decision to flee was not made lightly. In the days leading up to September 18th, Polish leaders had faced the grim reality of their situation. Warsaw was besieged by German forces, and the rapid Soviet advance from the east left no room for a coordinated defense. The Polish military was fragmented and unable to mount a unified response, while the civilian population suffered under constant bombardment and the threat of occupation. With no prospect of relief from the Allies and the country being carved up between Germany and the Soviet Union, the government concluded that leaving Poland was the only viable option to maintain a semblance of authority and continue the fight from abroad. As the Polish government crossed into Romania, the diplomatic situation grew increasingly complex. The Romanian authorities, caught between the pressures of their neighbors and the realities of the war, decided to intern the Polish government officials rather than allow them to operate freely from Romanian territory. This internment effectively stripped the Polish leadership of its ability to direct any further military resistance and underscored the dire straits in which Poland found itself. German and Soviet occupations, consolidating control. With the Polish government in exile, both Germany and the Soviet Union moved quickly to consolidate their control over Polish territory. The German Wehrmacht continued its advance into central Poland, tightening its grip around Warsaw and other key cities. The Luftwaffe maintained a punishing aerial bombardment campaign against Warsaw, targeting both military and civilian infrastructure in an effort to force a surrender and minimize German casualties in a potential ground assault. On September 18th, German forces began to systematically occupy key areas, disarming remaining Polish units, and establishing administrative control over their designated zones of occupation. The German occupation regime quickly imposed harsh measures on the local population, including curfews, forced labor, and the targeting of Polish intellectuals and military officers for arrest and execution. The goal was to crush any potential resistance and assert absolute control over the annexed territories. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Red Army continued its rapid advance, encountering minimal organized resistance. Soviet troops moved to occupy eastern Poland, as agreed upon in the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Soviet authorities immediately began implementing policies to integrate these territories into the Soviet state, including the nationalization of industries, the collectivization of agriculture, and the suppression of any political opposition. Thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. For the Polish population in the east, the Soviet occupation brought its own form of repression, marked by political purges, mass arrests, and the imposition of Soviet ideology. Warsaw under siege. The struggle continues. Despite the dire national situation, Warsaw remained a focal point of resistance. The city's defenders, composed of a mix of regular army units, local militias, and civilian volunteers, continued to prepare for a protracted siege. General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński coordinated the defense efforts, urging the population to remain steadfast in the face of the German onslaught. On September 18th, Warsaw's defenders faced an increasingly bleak situation. The German encirclement was nearly complete, and supplies of food, water, and medical resources were critically low. The constant bombing raids by the Luftwaffe further eroded the city's infrastructure, making it nearly impossible to maintain basic services or coordinate an effective defense. Despite these challenges, the spirit of defiance among Warsaw's inhabitants remained strong. Starzyński's daily radio broadcasts became a symbol of Polish resistance, calling on the population to hold out and resist the invaders at all costs. Inside the city, the humanitarian situation was deteriorating rapidly. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the injured, and the lack of supplies made it difficult to provide adequate care. Civilians, including women and children, took up roles in the defense effort, from digging trenches to preparing makeshift barricades. The resilience of Warsaw's population became a symbol of national pride and determination, even as the reality of the military situation made the prospect of holding out increasingly unlikely. The Allied response: strategic paralysis and reassessment. As the situation in Poland reached a critical point, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, continued to struggle with how best to respond to the rapidly evolving crisis. The decision of the Polish government to flee and the subsequent internment in Romania left the Allies in a difficult position, uncertain how to support a government that no longer had a presence on its own soil. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government was under increasing pressure to take more decisive action. The British public, already critical of the government's handling of the situation, was further angered by the apparent abandonment of Poland. On September 18th, the British War Cabinet met to discuss the implications of the Soviet invasion and the flight of the Polish government. There was a growing recognition that Britain would need to prepare for a long war, building up its military forces and coordinating more closely with France. Discussions continued about the possibility of launching air raids against German targets and increasing the naval blockade, but logistical challenges and concerns about readiness persisted. The British government also began to consider ways to support Polish forces that had managed to escape to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive in the face of occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar pressures. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived inaction. The flight of the Polish government further complicated the situation, leaving France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared, but this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic recalculations. The events of September 18th, including the flight of the Polish government and the continued advance of German and Soviet forces, prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality, but there was growing recognition of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 18th, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 18th, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 18th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the flight of the Polish government and the ongoing siege of Warsaw with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for Poland and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 18, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the flight of the government signaled the end of its ability to resist as a sovereign state. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support Poland directly, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Internationally, the continued advance of German and Soviet forces into Poland prompted further reassessments and strategic recalibrations. The United States maintained its official stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential global implications of the conflict. Italy and other nations watched closely, each calculating how best to navigate the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 18, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the flight of the Polish government and the continued advance of German and Soviet forces highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War. The events of this day underscored the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability.